Muhammad, Muslim prophet, or someone else entirely. Torpedo 3, written sources. Torpedo 3, contemporary non-Muslim sources. There are 7th and 8th century Christian sources that mention the Arabs, their religion, and a prophet, but they are not consistent with the standard Islamic narrative. The Arabs are called Ishmaelites, Hagarenes, or Saracens. They're not called Muslims. And Christian sources until 730, such as John of Damascus, viewed the religion of the Arabs as a Christian heresy. There is no mention of a separate non-Christian religion called Islam. Now, some sources do mention an Arab prophet, and some even use Muhammad, but they describe places and events that are not consistent with the Prophet Muhammad, quote-unquote, of the sin. For example, A, leading the Tayyaye, that is the people of Iraq. The Muhammad of the sin never left Arabia. B, going to Palestine, Syria, and Gaza to lead an army of 12,000 Jews. The Prophet Muhammad of the sin never went to these areas and never led an army of 12,000 Jews. And C, having the keys of paradise and proclaiming that another prophet would come after him. The standard Islamic narrative claims that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, that is the final prophet. So the Prophet Muhammad of the sin would never do or say things like this. Therefore, whoever this Muhammad was, it was not the Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative. Let's look at Muhammad in a 7th century source. The Maronite Chronicle of the 660s mentions Muhammad and Muawiyah. Remember that according to the standard Islamic narrative, Muawiyah was the 5th Muslim caliph. But the Chronicle says that Muawiyah went to Gethsemane, the tomb of Mary, and Golgotha to pray. Golgotha was the site of the cross. A true Muslim would never do this, as it would be considered blasphemy. Only a Christian would pray at these areas. Also, it says that Muawiyah ruled from Damascus, not Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was Muhammad's throne. The key question is, what is meant by Muhammad's throne? Christians believe that Jesus conquered sin and death at the cross, and now reigns as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Given that this happened at Jerusalem, it will be logical for people to believe that his throne was at Jerusalem. Therefore, Muhammad's throne is Jesus' throne. This means Jesus is the Muhammad, that is the chosen one. And what confirms this is that the standard Islamic narrative says that the Prophet Muhammad ruled from Mecca and Medina, but Muawiyah rules from Damascus. So it's much more likely that this reference to Muhammad is a reference to Jesus, and not the Prophet Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative. Did the Arabs have a separate religion? John of Damascus, who lived from 674 to 749 AD, worked in the court of several Islamic rulers, including Abdul Malik, who reigned from AD 685 to 705. He then left this employment to become a monk. During this time, he wrote several major works that give us a unique insight into the Arabs. And this is because he actually saw the goings-on behind the scenes, quote-unquote, as it were. His most important writing was an apologetic against Christian heresies that was written around 730. And one of these heresies was the, quote, heresy of the Ishmaelites, unquote, that is the Arabs. Now, you cannot have a heresy unless you have an original with which to compare it. So what would have been the original? Well, the obvious answer is Christianity. So despite the standard Islamic narrative claiming that the Arabs had a separate religion called Islam, those who are actually there describe the Arab religion as just another Christian heresy. Let's look at what John of Damascus actually tells us. John of Damascus gives us the following description of the Ishmaelite religion. The following bullet points are excerpts from John's writings. And from that time until now, a false prophet called Muhammad sprang up among them, who, after conversing with an Arian monk concerning the Old and New Testament, fabricated his own heresy. And after ingratiating himself and gaining favour from the people under a false pretense of piety, he spread rumours that a book had been sent down to him from heaven by God. Thus, heretical pronouncements inscribed in his book and worthy of laughter were instead handed down to them as something to be revered. He says there is one God, creator of all things, who has neither been begotten nor has begotten. He also says that Christ was the Word of God and his Spirit, but only a creature and a servant, and that he was born without seed from Mary, the sister of Moses and Aaron. For, he says, the Word of God and the Spirit entered into Mary and she gave birth to Jesus, who was a prophet and servant of God. And he says that the Jews unlawfully wanted to crucify him, but after arresting him they only crucified his shadow. For, he says, the Christ was not crucified, nor did he die. For God took him up to himself into heaven because he loved him. And this is from John of Damascus, the first apologist of the Muslims, by Daniel J. Janosik, 2016. Let's look at why John's writing is so relevant. Firstly, John is familiar with the beliefs of the Arabs, but he does not call it a separate religion. He uses the word heresy and heretical to describe it, and John specifically mentions Muhammad, who was influenced by an Arian monk. So, why is this significant? Because Arianism was a 3rd and 4th century Christian heresy that taught that Jesus was a created being and not God. In effect, Arius denied the doctrine of the Trinity, and this is significant for several reasons. A. The doctrine of the Trinity is one of the foundations of Christianity and is the single biggest objection that Muslims have to Christianity today. B. In AD 325, the Council of Nicaea addressed the Arian heresy. The outcome was that the Church confirmed the Trinity and rejected Arianism. So, contrary to the claims of some popular modern Muslim apologists, the doctrine of the Trinity was not invented at Nicaea. It was merely confirmed as the official doctrine of the Church. And C. Therefore, the religion of the Arabs in the late 7th to early 8th centuries was a form of Arianism. And John's description is similar to what Abdul Malik's coins and inscriptions say. Remember that John worked for Abdul Malik, and this confirms that John's description is accurate. So in conclusion, nearly 100 years after the death of the, quote, Prophet Muhammad, unquote, John of Damascus is describing the religion of the Ishmaelites as an Arian heresy of Christianity and not as a separate religion. Muhammad in the 8th century. We see that in AD 730, John calls the Arab prophet Muhammad. Note that this is 100 years after the death of the, quote, Prophet Muhammad, unquote, of the sin. The standard Islamic narrative claims that the stories we have heard about Muhammad were spread accurately by oral tradition, which means people were passing on what they heard. And if this tradition is true, then there should be consistency between what the original transmitters heard about Muhammad and what later observers call him. But John calls him Muhammad, and this is significant because unlike Arabic in the 7th century, Greek had vowels. Therefore, if people were using the name Muhammad, which is a 3-syllable word, then it would have been simple for John to write it in Greek as a 3-syllable word with both the consonants and the vowels. In Greek, it would look something like Muhammad. In contrast, John writes Mamed, which would be Mamev in Greek. We also note that people in former Persian lands, such as parts of Iran and Iraq, used Mahmet. So while you can get Mahmed and Mahmet if you are hearing Mahmud, you cannot get Mahmed, that's 2 syllables, if you are actually hearing Muhammad, that's 3 syllables. This strongly suggests that even in the 8th century, this figure, whoever he was referred to as Mahmud, not Muhammad. So we see that although the standard Islamic narrative says that Muhammad proclaimed a separate religion called Islam, even 100 years later we see a Mahmud proclaiming a Christian heresy. Torpedo 3 scores a direct hit. So when does Muhammad appear? John of Nicaea in AD 690 is the first to mention Muslim or a prophet Muhammad as opposed to Mahmud, outside the standard Islamic narrative. But this is 60 years after the Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative. Also, the earliest manuscript we have for this is 1602, which is nearly 1,000 years later, so this could well be a later redaction. But even if the sin is correct and the, quote, Prophet Muhammad, unquote, is so important, then why does nobody mention him by name for 60 years? It doesn't make sense. The standard Islamic narrative also says that the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad from AD 610 to 632. But the first mention of the Quran outside the sin is not until AD 710. This is 100 years after the sin says it was revealed. So the sources confirm what the archaeology suggests, that the Prophet Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative did not exist in the 7th century. Torpedo 3 scores a direct hit. Some Muslims claim that there actually are authentic 7th century references to Muhammad. Let's examine them. Firstly, we have the Ashtanami letter. Is this an authentic reference to Muhammad or a fake? The Ashtanami letter is a letter supposedly written by Muhammad or Ali to the monks in St. Catherine's Monastery, promising them protection and other privileges. But the problem is that it has many historical anachronisms. Firstly, we see that a minaret is pictured, and these were only created in the 9th century, but not used until the 11th century. It refers to Sultan, but this word was not used until approximately 350 years after Muhammad. It mentions mosques, but there were no mosques in Egypt until AD 641, which is nearly 10 years after the death of Muhammad. So how could this be a document from Muhammad himself? The Arabic used was Christian, Egyptian, and medieval Arabic, not the kind of Arabic that would have been used by the Arabs in the Hijaz. And finally, it refers to dhimmi laws that applied to groups such as Christians. The problem is that these laws only began centuries later. So the bottom line is that scholarly analysis shows that this document is not from the 7th century and does not support the historicity of the Prophet Muhammad of the sin. B. The Constitution of Medina. Is this evidence for Muhammad? The Constitution of Medina is a document that was supposedly created by Muhammad when he first moved to Medina sometime between 622 to 624 AD. It's alleged that this is an agreement between Muhammad and the Ansar, who are the native Arabs of Medina, as well as the native Jews of Medina. And Muslims consider it a model for agreements today and claim it's the, quote, oldest constitution for mankind. But there are several reasons to believe that it is not historically reliable. Firstly, there is no evidence of any Jews in Medina. Scholar Robert Hoyland says, quote, there is not a single clearly Jewish inscription that has been found at Mecca, Yathrib or Khaybar, despite quite a number of epigraphic surveys conducted at all three sites. It is only Muslim tradition that informs us of a Jewish community in Yathrib. Secondly, there is no reference to it outside the standard Islamic narrative. Scholar Frederick Denny says, quote, Ibn Ishaq preserved this document which does not appear in any other historical sources, unquote. And thirdly, it uses the term Muslim when the earliest recorded use of this term outside the standard Islamic narrative is in the 690s. So this document does not support the historicity of a 7th century Prophet Muhammad. Conclusion. We've seen that non-Muslim sources from the 7th century do not support the, quote, Prophet Muhammad of the sin. At best, they mention a Muhammad and show no evidence for a, quote, Prophet Muhammad of the sin. Also, these sources show that even into the 8th century, the religion of the Arabs was regarded as just another Christian heresy. And although there may have been a Muhammad or Muhammads, there was no Muhammad. And finally, documents from this time that are supposedly Muslim also do not support the existence of the Prophet Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative. They have serious historical inaccuracies and anachronisms and are unlikely to be from the 7th century. So bottom line, Torpedo 3 scores a direct hit.